Welcome to the On Air Philosophy channel. Today, we are going to explore two French philosophers, Levinas and Derrida, to see how, when they affirm each other's viewpoints, their own thoughts also gain broader meaning.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Imagine two genius architects trying to save a collapsing building. But instead of, working together to fix the foundation, they spent a decade trying to destroy each other's blueprints.
Yeah, that's a pretty accurate way to describe it.
Right, because that is essentially the dynamic we are diving into today. Our mission is to really unpack the profound, deeply conflicting, yet somehow wonderfully complementary philosophies of Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida. And guiding us through this intellectual battlefield is the author of a fascinating text titled A Preliminary Exploration of Decentralized Epistemology. So welcome.
Thanks again. In our research, we really wanted to dissect how traditional epistemology, meaning, the way we structure and validate what we actually know, has historically been far too centralized, far too rigid.
Yeah, definitely.
So we set out to investigate how breaking down that conceptual center might redefine the relationship between text, truth, and just, our basic humanity. And Levinas and Derrida, they serve as the ultimate case studies for this tension.
And for you listening right now, I know the phrase mid-20th century French philosophy might sound like a dense, abstract academic wall. But think of this deep dive as a practical shortcut.
A very practical one, yeah.
Right, a shortcut to understanding how we relate to the world and to the people around us, especially in those moments when our everyday systems, our institutions, our logic, our rules just completely fail us.
Exactly, when the system breaks down.
But to understand why these two specific thinkers decided to take a sledgehammer to the centuries-old house of Western philosophy, we have to look at what drove them. Like, what was the catalyst here?
Well, the catalyst was profound historical trauma, specifically the catastrophic violence of World War II. Both of these men were Jewish, and both were deeply, irrevocably scarred by the systemic evils of the mid-20th century, though in very different ways.
So let's start with Levinas.
Sure. If we look at Emmanuel Levinas first, he was a Lithuanian-born French philosopher, and when the war broke out, he was actually serving in the French military.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize he was in the military.
He was. And he was captured in 1940 and spent the next 5 years in a German prisoner of war camp.
5 years. That is an agonizing amount of time to be stripped of your freedom.
Stripped of freedom and completely stripped of basic human dignity. Because he was a Jewish POW in a German stalag, he was reduced to a mere number, a subhuman category.
God, that's horrific.
It was. He was treated as barely a living entity, just performing forced labor. And while he was trapped there, almost his entire family back in Lithuania was murdered in the Holocaust.
I am trying to wrap my head around how a philosopher even begins to process that level of systemic mechanized evil. You don't just walk out of a camp and go back to debating abstract theories in a classroom.
No, you really cannot. And Levinas didn't. He survived, and he turned his philosophical lens directly onto the very roots of the intellectual system that allowed such atrocities to happen in the first place.
So he went after the whole foundation.
He traced the problem all the way back to the ancient Greeks. He realized that Western philosophy has had this massive, enduring obsession with what we call ontology, which is the study of being.
Okay, wait. I want to make sure I'm following this leap. How does wondering about the nature of existence lead to a totalitarian system?
Yeah, it's a big jump, but it comes down to categorization. Think about how a system of thought actually works. To understand something, you have to define it. Right?
Right. You put it in a box.
Exactly. You assimilate it into a neat conceptual framework. He argued that whenever you prioritize studying what is, you inevitably create a philosophy of totality. In a philosophy of totality, anything that is different, unpredictable, or other is seen as a problem that must be solved.
You get swallowed up by the system.
Yes, swallowed up and forced to become part of the same. And Levinas saw that this is not just some harmless academic sorting mechanism.
No, because it has real-world consequences.
Real violent consequences. When you apply this to humanity, when you reduce individual, infinitely complex human beings to mere categories, to replaceable cogs in a historical or political machine, well, violence is the inevitable mechanical result.
So the Holocaust wasn't an aberration of Western logic. It was the horrifying ultimate conclusion of totalizing thought.
That is the grim reality Levinas perceived.
It was the system working exactly as it was designed, sorting people into categories of useful or to be eliminated.
Precisely. So to dismantle this, he completely inverted the philosophical hierarchy. He declared that ontology must be dethroned.
And what did he put in its place?
He proposed ethics as first philosophy. For Levinas, before you even open your mouth to ask what is the nature of the universe, you are already faced with a fundamental, inescapable responsibility to the other.
Okay, that makes sense.
And to anchor this, he developed his central, most powerful concept, the face of the other.
The face. And I imagine we aren't just talking about like the physical arrangement of a nose, mouth, and eyes here.
No. We are talking about raw vulnerability. The face represents the absolute, unassimilable, defenseless presence of another human being.
So it's about the encounter.
Exactly. When you truly encounter the face of the other, it shatters your neat little categories.
Yeah.
It presents an ethical demand that you cannot ignore, and you cannot force it into a spreadsheet or a political theory.
It's powerful.
Levinas famously said that the face silently but absolutely commands thou shalt not kill. It is a demand that precedes all language and all logic.
Okay, so Levinas experiences this horrific trauma from the outside, from within a prison camp. And his response is to use the visceral vulnerability of the human face to break the entire system of totality.
That's right.
But Derrida didn't experience the war from a POW camp. Yeah. His trauma was different, right? How does his background shape a different philosophical weapon?
Well, Derrida was an Algerian Jew born in 1930. And in 1942, when he was just 12 years old, the anti-Semitic laws of the Vichy French government were enacted in Algeria.
Just 12 years old.
Yeah. One day he went to school and the principal simply told him he was no longer allowed to attend. He was expelled from his school, from his community, simply for being Jewish.
God, to be a child, completely embedded in a system you trust, and then suddenly have that system draw a circle and declare you are outside of it, I mean, that is a trauma of marginalization from within.
It is a profound betrayal by the very structures of society. And that specific experience of being violently pushed to the margins shaped his entire intellectual trajectory.
So how did he attack the system?
Where Levinas attacked totality, Derrida targeted what he called logocentrism.
Logocentrism, what does that mean?
It's the pervasive, almost invisible assumption in Western thought that there's always a pure dominant center. Whether we call it reason, truth, God, or pure origin, there's this idea that a center anchors our reality and guarantees meaning.
And I'm guessing that center is what decides who gets to stay in the school and who gets expelled.
Precisely the underlying mechanism. So Derrida developed his famous method of deconstruction to expose how this works. He showed that establishing any center always, by definition, requires violently excluding and repressing the margins.
Right. You have an inside, you have to have an outside.
Exactly. If reason is the center, then the irrational must be exiled. If a certain type of speech is the standard, then all others are dialects or errors.
So how does deconstruction actually work in practice?
Deconstruction is basically the practice of reading texts and systems so closely that you find the hidden contradictions. You show how the center is actually dependent on the very margins it tries to repress.
Okay, let me see if I'm picturing this right. They both recognize that the massive house of Western philosophy is deeply oppressive and inherently violent. But it sounds like, well, Levinas is standing outside the house, pointing at the actual people being crushed underneath the floorboards, demanding we look at them, while Derrida, is he already inside the house, like sneaking around and quietly unscrewing the hinges so the doors just naturally fall off?
That is a highly effective way to visualize it, yeah. Levinas confronts the system from the outside, using the undeniable reality of human vulnerability to halt the machine.
And Derrida?
Derrida infiltrates the system from the inside. He uses its own language and its own internal logic against it, showing how it is constantly collapsing under its own weight.
Okay, so they have the same enemy, they share a common background of persecution. You could assume they would form a united front, right?
Yeah.
Two brilliant minds dismantling the structures of violence together.
You would think so, but they didn't. They essentially went to war with each other.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because they launched some brilliant critiques against each other.
They did. It produced some of the most rigorous, challenging philosophical debates of the 20th century. It began in 1964. Derrida published a monumental essay titled Violence and Metaphysics.
And this was aimed at Levinas.
It was a direct surgical critique of Levinas's masterwork, Totality and Infinity.
But what was Derrida's issue with Levinas? I mean, if Levinas is just saying we need to prioritize the human face over cold systems, how do you attack that?
Well, Derrida didn't attack the ethical goal. He attacked the methodological impossibility of Levinas's project.
Oh, the way he was trying to do it.
Right. Remember, Levinas was trying to completely escape the language of being and ontology so he could talk about an absolute other, something totally pure, completely outside the violent system of Western thought.
Okay. Yeah.
Derrida asked a devastatingly simple question. How can you possibly write a philosophy book without using words like is or being?
Oh, wow. You literally can't. Every sentence requires a state of being, like the face is vulnerable. You are trapped in the grammar.
And that is exactly what we analyze in our research. Derrida demonstrated that the very second Levinas put pen to paper, he was forced to borrow the ontological language he was trying to destroy.
So he was using the master's tools.
Exactly. By relying on the language of the system to critique the system, Levinas was inadvertently perpetuating the very conceptual violence he was trying to escape.
That is brutal.
And furthermore, Derrida argued a deeper phenomenological point. He said you cannot even perceive an other without a background of the same.
Wait, unpack that for me. Why do I need the same to see the other?
Think of it like contrast. If the other is completely, absolutely disconnected from you, existing in a realm of pure infinity without any shared ground, well, you wouldn't even have the capacity to recognize them as another.
Ah, right.
You only know a margin exists because you understand the concept of a page. By insisting on absolute separation, Derrida argued, Levinas risks making the other entirely incomprehensible.
That is a massive blow. I mean, Derrida essentially traps Levinas in a linguistic cage.
Yeah.
How long did it take Levinas to formulate a response to that?
It took him a full decade.
A decade.
Yes. But in 1974, Levinas struck back with his second major book, Otherwise Than Being. And he aimed his critique directly at the heart of Derrida's deconstruction, specifically targeting Derrida's famous concept of difference.
Difference. Spelled with an A. I know this is a notorically tricky concept. Before we get to Levinas's attack, how does difference actually work?
The simplest way to understand difference is to look in a dictionary. When you look up a word, what do you find?
More words.
Right, more words. So you look up those words and you find even more words. The meaning of a word is never just sitting there as a pure, isolated object.
Right, it's always pointing to something else.
Yes, meaning is always based on its difference from other words. And the ultimate, final meaning is always deferred, pushed further down the line. Derrida argued that all of reality, all texts, operate like this.
So there's no solid ground.
Exactly. There is no final, solid truth you can point to. Everything is an endless, shifting play of differences.
So it's an infinite web where meaning is perpetually delayed.
Yeah.
Okay, so how does Levinas use that against Derrida?
Levinas looked at this infinite delay and saw a terrifying ethical void. He argued that if meaning is always a play of differences, if truth is endlessly deferred, then that completely erases the flesh and blood urgency of ethics.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Levinas essentially asked if everything is just a textual game and endless deferral of meaning, what happens to your immediate visceral responsibility when you are standing face to face with a starving, suffering human being?
The starving person cannot wait for you to finish deconstructing the dictionary.
Exactly the point. Levinas charged that an infinite delay in meaning can easily become a highly sophisticated academic excuse to evade urgent ethical demands. Because if the truth is always delayed, then maybe my responsibility to help you is delayed too. For Levinas, the ethical call of the face does not wait for textual deconstruction to run its course. It interrupts the text. It demands an answer, an action, right here, right now.
So we have a genuine deadlock. Derrida says Levinas's escape plan is linguistically impossible because you can't step outside language. And Levinas says Derrida's linguistic games ignore the bleeding reality of human suffering because you can't just delay ethics. It feels like a philosophical stalemate between two absolute geniuses. Where do we even go from here?
Well, what's fascinating here is that this apparent stalemate is the very core of what we set out to resolve in our paper.
Okay, I am extremely curious to hear how you untangle this knot.
In our research, we realized that these two titans of philosophy aren't actually trapped in a deadlock at all. They only appear to be at odds because we are viewing them through a fractured lens. So we introduce a framework in our paper that we call holistic philosophy.
Holistic philosophy, what does that entail?
The foundational idea here is that true philosophy cannot be a static, singular viewpoint. It must be a dynamic circulatory cycle. We outline this cycle in three distinct but interconnected phases.
Okay, lay them out for me.
First, there is knowledge. which represents the form, the structure, the text, the language. Second, there is ethics, which is the application, the visceral reality, the present shore we are actually standing on.
Right.
And third, there is metaphysics, which is the body, the ideal, the beyond, the future we are aiming for.
Knowledge, ethics, metaphysics. The structure, the action, the ideal. Okay, I have the map.
Yeah.
So how does this resolve the stalemate?
Well, through this holistic framework, we argue that Levinas and Derrida are actually speaking of the exact same philosophical cycle. They are describing the same organism.
Really? They're on the same page.
The perceived stalemate only exists because they are entering this cycle at entirely different starting points. They are driven by the different primary concerns born from their distinct traumas.
Let's test that theory. Walk me through the cycle starting with Levinas. Where's his entry point?
Levinas's entry point is squarely in application, the realm of ethics and the face of the other. He starts in the raw, visceral, real-world encounter.
Okay, so he starts at step 2.
Right. He uses this profound, immediate ethical responsibility to shatter the rigid totality of knowledge, the oppressive systems, the ontologies, the bureaucratic categories of the West. And by shattering that structure, he points us toward an infinite, ungraspable metaphysics beyond that transcends mere existence.
So he uses the human connection to break the rigid system and look toward the infinite. That makes sense. But what about Derrida? Does he start at knowledge?
He does. Derrida's entry point is knowledge, the text, the language, the existing structures, the inside of the house, as you said earlier.
Right, unscrewing the hinges.
Exactly. He starts by meticulously reading the texts of Western philosophy to deconstruct their rigid laws and boundaries. But the crucial question is, why does he deconstruct them? He isn't doing it just to be difficult. In his later work, Derrida explicitly stated that deconstruction is driven by an underlying, absolute, undeconstructible desire for justice.
Justice, which is ethics.
Exactly. He dismantles knowledge specifically to serve ethics. And this constant, rigorous unbuilding and rebuilding of systems points toward a future, a justice that is always to come, which functions as his version of metaphysics.
Let me process this. If this holistic philosophy is a circulatory system, a living body, is it fair to say Derrida is focusing on the blood vessels, the language, the laws, the intricate structures that carry things around, while Levinas is focusing on the beating heart, the immediate pulsating ethical demand?
Yes.
And the realization here is that a body needs both to survive. They can't exist without each other.
That analogy captures the essence of our argument beautifully. They are two halves of a vital living process.
Because without one, the other fails.
Right. If you only have Levinas's beating heart, but you have no blood vessels to carry that ethical impulse into the messy world of laws, politics, and language, then his ethics remains an abstract theology. It just floats away.
And on the flip side,
conversely, if you only have Derrida's blood vessels, the endless deconstruction of texts and laws without the beating heart of an undeniable ethical responsibility, then deconstruction degrades into a nihilistic, cynical word game.
wow.
This holistic view prevents us from getting trapped in just one perspective. It reveals that dismantling an oppressive system and caring for a vulnerable human being are, in fact, part of the exact same philosophical motion.
That completely reframes how I view their entire debate. They aren't destroying each other, they are completing the circuit. But I want to push back on the practicality of this for the listener, because, I mean, this is a brilliant academic synthesis, but how does seeing them as part of this holistic cycle actually change how we use their ideas when we wake up tomorrow?
That is the most vital question. If we connect this theoretical cycle to the bigger picture of our daily lives, seeing them holistically allows their thoughts to seamlessly merge and expand their implicit meanings. They actually cure each other's blind spots. Let's look at what they gift to one another when fused. Levinas gives Derrida's deconstruction its absolute gravity.
Absolute gravity, meaning it grounds the endless web of words into something real.
Yes. Without Levinas, as we noted, deconstruction can easily feel like a highly intelligent but ultimately pointless academic exercise.
Right.
Tearing down texts just to show you are clever enough to do it.
Right, just playing with words.
Exactly. But the ethical demand of the face Levinas's core realization prevents Derrida's tools from spiraling into nihilism. It gives deconstruction a clear, undeniable purpose. We do not deconstruct laws and systems for fun. We deconstruct them because they are doing actual violence to marginalized people. Levinas provides the why.
And what does Derrida give Levinas in return? What is the how?
Derrida gives Levinas the precise medium. Levinas wanted to transcend language and being to reach a pure, absolute other. But Derrida reminds Levinas, and all of us really, that we cannot magically float outside of language, culture, and institutions.
We have to live in the world.
We must inhabit the system. We have to use the very language of the system to change the system.
Because if you just reject the system entirely and refuse to engage with it, you have zero power to enact actual justice in the real world. You need the courts, you need the legal documents, you need the corporate policies, even if you know they are flawed and totalizing.
Precisely. The Derrida grounds Levinas's ethics in gritty reality. He provides the sharp, critical tools necessary to actually dismantle the totalizing systems that Levinas recognized as the root of violence. You cannot stop a totalitarian machine just by looking at it ethically. You have to know how to unscrew its gears.
And this brings it all the way back to you, the listener. The reason you should care about this complex fusion of two seemingly contradictory French philosophers is because every single day of your life, you are operating within systems. You work in corporate hierarchies, you navigate complex legal frameworks, you participate in social norms, you use language. That is Derrida's realm. And we know that those systems, even the ones built with the absolute best intentions, will eventually establish a center by pushing someone else to the margins.
Always. Systems require categorization, and categorization always leaves someone out.
And understanding this dynamic cycle gives you a superpower. Thanks to Derrida, you can navigate those systems critically. You learn to look at the rules of your workplace or your society and ask, who is this excluding? Where are the margins here?
Right.
But at the exact same time, thanks to Levinas, you never lose sight of the immediate visceral humanity of the actual people standing right in front of you. You don't let your coworkers or your neighbors become just data points in a system you are analyzing. This fusion teaches us how to be ethically hyper-aware without being naive about how systemic power actually works.
Which leaves us with a profound challenge. In our daily encounters, we must constantly ask ourselves, are we seeing the person in front of us as an individual to whom we have an infinite, unpayable responsibility? Or have we quietly reduced them to a mere concept within our own totalizing worldview?
That is the core tension we all have to live in. And it leaves us with a final, slightly uncomfortable thought for you to mull over today.
Mm-hmm.
If we're constantly trying to fully understand the people in our lives, our partners, our friends, our colleagues, if we were always trying to figure them out, to categorize their behavior, to put them into a neat psychological box so that we feel more secure and comfortable, are we actually committing a tiny, everyday act of violence? Are we trapping them in the totality of our own minds? Perhaps true, profound connection isn't about perfectly understanding the other. Maybe it's about accepting and respecting the absolute impossibility of ever fully knowing them and choosing to love them within that mystery. Thank you for listening. I hope this text has been helpful and inspiring to you. See you next time.